Hello, everyone. If you could find your seats, we'd like to begin the second panel. My name is Raquel Euclides. Today, I head the collections of the National Library of Israel, and we are thrilled to partner with the Center for Jewish History for this symposium and an array of programs and projects that we are developing. And so I want to thank the Center for Jewish History for hosting and developing this symposium, and for launching a year-long exploration of these big questions related to Zionism. Now, the truth is that the impetus for this panel and this symposium was to spend the time to unpack and thicken and challenge the ideas around Zionism today. Because in contrast to what Einat Wilf said in the first panel, where there's no point to go back to history and to look at alternate histories, today Zionism has become a very thinned out, effaced term, almost a polemical term, like a baseball team or a soccer team where I live now. You're either for or you're against Zionism. And so history here plays a very important role, and that is to create the space to take another look and to remember what we have lost over time. And so we've structured this panel, and I will soon introduce our distinguished panelists. We've structured the panel to hear about three different trajectories among the many different trajectories and ideologies and approaches that American Jews and Jews throughout the world had when it came to Jewish nationalism and Zionism and these questions about the Jewish problems before there was a state. And so even though we're doing a kind of naive leap back into history, where we're in a period where they don't know what we know, right, that in 1948 a state is established, we're doing it on purpose in order to mine these ideologies and approaches and these quirky individuals who we'll hear about in order to remember and pull up ideas that I think have gotten lost over time. So I want to introduce our panelists. Professor Zohar Segev, to my left, is professor of Jewish history at the University of Haifa. Segev has published a number of books and many articles on American Jewish history, including his 2014 book published by De Gruyter, The World Jewish Congress During the Holocaust, Between Activism and Restraint, and his recent 2022 book published by Brill entitled Immigration, Ideology, and Public Activity from an American Jewish Perspective, A Journey Across Three Continents. Segev's last paper, called Rethinking the Dilemma of Bombing Auschwitz, Support, Opposition, and Reservation, was published in the Jewish Quarterly Review in 2021. And in 2020 and 2021, Professor Segev was a fellow of the New York Public Library in Fordham for his research. Our second panelist is Adina Hoffman, essayist and biographer. She is the author of 5 books, including Till We Have Built Jerusalem, Architects of a New City, Ben Hecht, Fighting Words, Moving Pictures, and My Happiness Bears No Relation to Happiness, A Poet's Life in the Palestinian Century. The latter was named one of the best 20 books of 2009 by the Barnes & Noble Review and won the UK's Jewish Quarterly Wingate Prize. She is also the author with Peter Cole of Sacred Trash, The Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza, which was awarded the American Library Association's Sophie Brody Medal for Outstanding Achievement in Jewish Literature. The recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, Hoffman was among the inaugural winners of the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize. She lives in Jerusalem and New Haven. And finally, Yuval Ivri is assistant professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and the Marash and Oku Wien Chair in Ottoman, Mizrahi, and Sephardic Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. He is a cultural historian specializing in Sephardi and Mizrahi modern history and culture, with a particular interest in Palestine, Eretz Israel during the first half of the 20th century. His current book project traces the invention of the Mizrahim/Sfaradim as go-betweens and mediators on the borderline that emerged between the Jew and the Arab and between Hebrew and Arabic, and explores how the fluidity inherent in this position became a source of resistance to the dominant national and monolingual forces. His last book, entitled The Return to Al-Andalus, Disputes over Sephardic Culture and Identity Between Arabic and Hebrew, was published by Magnus Press in 2020. And now I turn to Professor Zohar Segev.
Thank you, Rahel, for your opening remarks. I'm grateful for the invitation, and it's wonderful to be here. The crisis of Jewish existence in Europe from the 20th of the last century until its tragic path in the Holocaust caused a significant change in the attitude of American Jews and their leadership toward the Zionist movement in the first stage and the State of Israel in the second stage. Its peak was the unprecedented political and economic support of American Jewry for the establishment and consideration of the State of Israel. It is difficult to see how the State of Israel would have been established without this support. But as we move away from the dramatic events of the first half of the last century, we return to the previous normal situation in which support for the establishment of a Jewish state and the existence of a Jewish sovereignty in Palestine was only one of the components of the American Jewish identity and not necessarily the most important one. Chaim Weizmann, the future president of the Zionist movement and the first president of Israel, understood with his keen political sense the fact that even the Zionists in the United States refer to a Jewish existence in Palestine as only one of the components of a Jewish existence in modern time. This is evident in Chaim Weizmann's letter to Felix Frankfurter, a Zionist activist, professor of law at Harvard, and future US Supreme Court justice in the summer of 1990. Weizmann wrote the letter as part of the struggle between him and Brandeis, that we mentioned in the previous session, over the design of the Zionist financing system after the Balfour Declaration. Weizmann presented his view of the founding principle of Zionism according to his conception and presented the differences between him and Brandeis and Frankfurter as the representative of American Zionism. Weizmann stressed that Zionism was built around one fundamental principle, which is international Jewish activity in national format for the return of the Jews to the land of Israel and the establishment of a Jewish life there. To clarify this point, he wrote that Brandeis, you can see it here in the letter, could have played a role in the Zionist movement similar to that Brandeis could have been a puppet in Israel, and Frankfurter could have played a role in the Zionist movement similar to that of the Jewish socialist leader Ferdinand Lassalle in the German worker movement. But Brandeis chose to be only a justice in the Supreme Court, and Frankfurter chose to be only a professor of law at Harvard University. As I mentioned in the beginning, from the late 30s, we can consider the American Jewry as the most important community within the international Jewish framework and the Zionist movement. But the leadership of the American Zionist movement was not content to serve Zionism and the Jewish community in Palestine economically and politically. They also tried to use the window of opportunity to influence the development and structure of the future Jewish national home. Just how deeply American Zionism was involved in the future of the Middle East is apparent in relation to the Hadassah activity in the 40s. Hadassah, established in 1912 as a women's organization, speedily became maybe the most important body in the Zionist world in general, in American Zionists in particular. At the 40s, Hadassah leaders set up patterns that went beyond the limits reserved for women's organization, involving themselves in formulating policy for the world movement and in security and economic issue in Palestine. This was most marked as regards the Arab question. The Committee for Jewish-Arab Relations was central to Hadassah attempts to influence Zionist policy regarding the Arabs. The head of the committee was Hadassah Vice President was Jacobs. And here you can see a letter from Henrietta Zold from Palestine to Rose Jacobs, and she explained that it's not an historical issue, but it's a political issue that deals with the fundamental question of how Palestine should be built. Ben-Gurion was invited to the committee meetings in 1941. At the start of the meeting, Rose Jacobs set forth the committee's ideological basis. The committee was defined as a political body and a research group that would supply information, proposal, and idea to the American and world Zionist leadership. Ben-Gurion, however, the future first prime minister of Israel and head of the Jewish agency at the time, however, put forth a quite different view of the committee's purpose, with a quite different concept of the Hadassah future political role. He opposed Jacob's speech, limiting the committee's role to confronting pro-Arab propaganda. He declared the committee part of the Zionist public relations system and not a research body. He explained that during his short stay in Palestine in 1941, from 1938 till 1942, most of the time Ben-Gurion was in the United States. So I explained that during his short stay in Palestine in 1941, he dealt little with the Arab with Jewish-Arab relations, as no discussion partners could be found among Arab leaders. Many Israeli leaders today would agree with Ben-Gurion. Later, in the discussion, Ben-Gurion presented an objection in principle, beside the political and organizational objections, to an independent American Zionist body dealing with the Arab issue. He also came out against the attempt of Hadassah women to influence the development of the issue, emphasizing that the committee has no authority to formulate Zionist policy on the Arab issue. In his view, Hadassah women were not allowed to have their own program for the future of Palestine. Hadassah leaders were well aware that they could affect Jewish-Arab relations in Palestine through the cooperation patterns they created there in the healthcare system. Nonetheless, the Committee for Jewish-Arab Relations was something quite different. The committee created patterns that could be defined as evolutionary in the Zionist agenda. Do you still have a few minutes, or it's...
You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. So maybe I will take 1 minute.
Yes.
And I will read what Ben-Gurion related to American interest in the Arab issue on another occasion, before Mapai, Eretz Israel Labour Party members. Possibly because his audience was of his own party, he spoke much more sharply there. And I quote, "For much of the Zionist movement in the United States, the World War doesn't exist." It was in 1941. The World War doesn't exist. Hitler doesn't exist. The destruction of our people doesn't exist. And the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Eretz Israel, is not in great danger. For them, there is only the Arab question. And not only is there Arab question, but they have the solution to it. And they also know why the solution is not being used, because the Zionist leadership is interfering. I suspect some of those present think I am drawing a caricature, but this is a signed document circulated among all Zionist circles in America. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to do this really fast because I have a lot I want to say. I'm a writer who tends to think biographically, so I'm going to introduce you to someone who I've written about and whose life and work, I think, have something to tell us about all these questions that are being raised today. So if I could have the first slide. This person, not that slide, just hit one more. So this is Ben Hecht. He is not very well known today. He's been largely forgotten, but in his time, he was born in 1894, 1893, take your pick. He changed his mind all the time. He was known for all kinds of things. He was a journalist, he was a novelist, he was a playwright, and he was most famously, please, the next slide, a screenwriter. He was one of the greatest screenwriters in American history. Pauline Kael called him the greatest American screenwriter, and he's really responsible in many ways for all of these great films. He was also a Jew, and interestingly, he was a Jew who claimed that he became a Jew in 1939. Now, I question that seriously, because he was born on the Lower East Side, his first language was Yiddish, He, give me a break. He also had written a book in 1931 called A Jew in Love. He already had it on the brain. But he's obviously making a point by singling out the year 1939, and this is a retrospective account of his trajectory. A few years, and he's obviously talking about what was going on in Europe and how it had raised his own consciousness to the fact of his own Jewishness. A few years before, in 37, 38, he actually wrote a very powerful short story called A Little Candle, in which he recounts, or he describes a scene in the near future, the not too distant future, in which an American Jew gets to his kitchen table in the morning, pours a cup of coffee, opens the newspaper, and reads what Hecht describes as something called the Great International Pogrom. And this is something that Hecht is already imagining, and it's a situation in which several million Jews are run out of their homes and slaughtered. And he writes that we stared with nausea and disbelief at the print. On this July morning, we were Jews again, whatever our previous conception of ourselves had been. So he's obviously describing himself. Excuse me. Around the same time, a few years later, he began to write articles, columns for PM Magazine, a sort of liberal tabloid in New York. And again, the subject of what was going on in Europe was a major subject for him there, and he kept saying, Jew, Jew, Jew. It was like a word that he wanted to rub in the faces of Americans. This was uncomfortable for a lot of American Jews, also to constantly be hearing about his Jewishness and his feelings of Jewishness. There was a sense of people wanting to just keep quiet about it. He wrote articles with names like My Tribe is Called Israel, and it was one of these articles, or several of these articles, that caused him, as he later said, to bump into history. And in the next slide, we'll see what he actually, or who he bumped into. This is a man named Hillel Kook, who was a Lithuanian-born Palestinian Jew who was part of the illustrious Kook family, rabbinical family in Palestine, who had come in 1940 to the United States as an Irgun activist, an activist with the right-wing nationalist underground in Palestine. He came with just a few comrades. They considered themselves a sort of unit of a liberation army, and Hillel Kook, who had taken on a nom de guerre, he called himself Peter Bergson, was their commander. And Bergson read these articles of Hecht's and said, this is our man. We need an American who understands how to talk to Americans, sees their imaginations, because what we're here to do is raise money for a Jewish army. And we need Hecht to help us. So he turned to Hecht and asked him, and at first Hecht said, go away, I'm totally not interested, I don't know about Palestine, I don't care, I'm not political. But he was eventually won over, and he was won over by a kind of romance. He saw these guys as sort of knights who were going off to save some helpless maiden. Ben Hecht did not have a very sophisticated notion of Jewish history, but let's just leave that as it is. So he agreed to help them, and they started trying to raise money for this army. And then something happened, and this is something that happened on a day that Peter Bergson would later call the most traumatic day of his life. He was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. He got up. He sat down at his kitchen table, he poured himself a cup of coffee, and he basically reenacted Ben Hecht's story. This is November of 1942. He opened the Washington Post, and he had to get all the way to page 6, where in very, very tiny, tiny letters, the headline said, I want to get it right, it just said, 2 million Jews slain, Rabbi Weiss asserts. So this is Rabbi Stephen Weiss, telling America and the world of the news that they have gotten, that this slaughter is going on. And so that very day, Bergson and Hecht completely changed course. So they've given up basically on the idea of a Jewish army. They are now going to save the Jews of Europe. That becomes their plan. The committee that they have formed changes its name. They're now going to be the Committee to Save the Jews of Europe. And Hecht gets down to work doing what he always does, which is to pull out his pen. And if we could have the next slide, you'll see what that pen cooked up. A series of incredibly noisy, colorful, brilliant, biting ads that he took out, full-page ads in American newspapers, with How Well Are You Sleeping? Ballad of the Doomed Jews of Europe. For sale to humanity, 70,000 Jews, guaranteed human beings at $50 apiece. You can imagine that this did not make him popular with the American Jewish establishment, which basically thought that these were just a bunch of hotheads and interlopers who had absolutely no business speaking for the American Jewish community. But Hecht and Bergson did continue to speak out in this scathing, kind of this, using his wit. Hecht was doing this, but meaning it, really meaning it, and also trying more sort of establishment modes, like the next slide you'll see. He wrote a pageant called We Will Never Die. Kurt Weill wrote the music. Billy Rose staged it, Moss Hart. They held this at Madison Square Garden. It had the largest audience that had ever packed itself in. This is early 1943. So this was, again, to try to raise the consciousness of Americans, not just Jews, to what was going on. As the war went on, and as things got sort of hotter in Palestine on the ground, and Menachem Begin, who was the head of the Irgun in Palestine, launched a bloody revolt against the British, they also changed their tune one more time. So now, as the war came to a close, they shifted from wanting to simply to save the Jews of Europe, which they obviously failed at quite massively, to focusing on creating support for this rebellion, this revolt, and to also raising money to bring Jews illegally into Palestine, to sort of run the British blockade. There were extreme limitations on Jewish immigration that had been put in place since 1939 by the British. So the next slide, please. Bergson opened up an embassy, an unofficial embassy in Washington, D.C., and flew the flag. And in the next slide, you'll see what Hecht did. Again, he started writing. He wrote a play called A Flag is Born, which when I went to the archives, I found was originally titled Palestine is Ours, and neither is very subtle, but this is even, okay, that was less subtle. This was a propaganda piece, plain and simple, again, with music by Kurt Weill. Paul Muni, otherwise known as Scarface, starred, along with Celia Adler, star of the Yiddish stage, and one more slide, and another actor, a young American named Marlon Brando. And basically, they wanted to, it provided a kind of catharsis. This was a play in which the cemeteries of Europe are left behind for the battlefields of Palestine. They raised a lot of money. That was also the goal. And with it, the next slide, you'll see what they bought, a ship. And this is a ship that set sail from Staten Island, 1946, late 1946, sailed to Marseille, loaded up 625 DPs, early 1947, and set out ostensibly for Bolivia. And then as soon as they got out of French territorial waters, the captain got on to the loudspeaker and said, "We're changing course, we're going to Palestine." He raised the flag, and then he said, "And we're changing the name of this ship." One more slide, please. It's the SS Ben Hecht. So, needless to say, the Royal Navy intercepted the ship. Everyone was deported. The passengers were sent to Cyprus. The American crew was sent back to America. And Hecht was enraged. Of course, it was his way. He was a pretty angry person, but he wasn't just enraged because the boat with his name on it was turned back. He was furious at what he saw as this betrayal of the Jewish home by the British. And so he did what he always did, took out that pen and wrote again. And you'll see the reason I showed you all that other stuff is so that you'll see where this next thing is coming from. And this is, Raquel had asked us to each pick a text, so I've used up most of my time, but I do want to show you the text and read you a snippet of it. Here we go. Letter to the terrorists of Palestine. Just let that sink in for a minute. My brave friends, okay? And he says, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, it's very long. And this is, I should say, the most notorious thing Ben Hecht ever wrote. This is the guy who actually wrote Notorious. So he says, the Jews of America are for you. You are their champions. You are the grin they wear. You are the feather in their hats. And then he goes on, and then this is the clincher. He says, every time you blow up a British arsenal or wreck a British jail or send a British railroad train sky high or rob a British bank or let go with your guns and bombs at the British betrayers and invaders of your homeland, the Jews of America make a little holiday in their hearts. So, think about that and think about the equivalent, if you want, in modern terms. I hear, is that the bell? Okay, I'm being pulled. But I will just leave you with one thought, and it's this, that this is ostensibly written to the terrorists of Palestine, but I think it's a letter written directly to the American Jewish community, and we can talk about why I think that's the case later. Yeah.
Thank you. Before we turn to our third panelist, I just want to start pulling some of these threads together for you, okay? We're in a period where most American Jews are not Zionists. They're not, and they're certainly not active Zionists. And so we're hearing the voices of discrete individuals who are trying to address the problems that the first panel started to outline. And we're already hearing different approaches. From Zohar's presentation, we're already noticing that this is not just Zionism as a set of ideas and American Jews. American Jews are in dialogue with the Zionist leadership in other countries. We see so clearly from Adina's presentation how American Jews are responding to what is happening in Europe and in Palestine. And so we're already seeing a much messier, more dynamic situation of how people are responding to events in motion. I now want to turn to Professor Ivry Yuval, who's going to throw in yet another angle here. And then I'll invite all of you to respond to each other and to help us pull some of these threads to develop, like what are we learning about Zionism through these different angles and trajectories.
Okay, so in my short opening words, I want to shift the focus to the native Sephardi community of Palestine.
Sorry.
Yeah, so in my short opening words, I want to shift the focus to the native Sephardi community of Palestine and how they experienced and viewed the transition from Ottoman to British mandatory rule. So the end of the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a dramatic moment in the history of the Sephardi community throughout the Ottoman Empire. It was a time of shifting national and imperial orders, dismembering and partition of territories, and creation of new political entities. It also crashed the social and political structure of multiplicity that shaped the world of the Ottoman Sephardim for decades. These dramatic changes drove thousands of Sephardi Jews to immigrate to the Americas from their homeland in the Ottoman land. In Palestine, the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate brought a new political logic: partition and separation along strict national lines and competing loyalties. Strict social and national borders replaced social fluidity and shared life, forcing these local Ottoman Sephardi communities to choose between conflicting national identities and loyalties. Their identities as Arabs, Ottomans, and Jews were transformed into conflicting and opposing loyalties. They became a source of suspicion and marginalization by the emerging Arab and Jewish national movements. Within the new social order, the Sephardim lost their leadership position as representative of the local Jewish community and were marginalized by the new Zionist leadership. Unlike the Zionist leadership, the Sephardi Jews emphasized the importance of the native Arab Palestinians population and advocated for a direct political and cultural dialogue with them. They offered a different political vision based on a logic of a shared homeland instead of the logic of partition and separation. I want to present now two case studies of native Sephardic intellectuals, Yosef Chaim Kastel and Chaim Ben Kiki, who proposed, each in his own way, a critical analysis and alternative interpretation of the motives and implication of the Balfour Declaration. So Chaim Ben Kiki was born in 1887 in Tiberias to a Sephardi Maghrebi family. He studied at the town's communal schools, attained self-taught fluency in several languages, and began publishing articles in Hebrew and Arabic newspapers. Although he did not publish many articles, he presented a well-formed and bold political stance in his writings. His articles stood out in light of the political and social euphoria that gripped the leadership of the Zionist Yishuv after the Balfour Declaration. The Zionist passion for the Balfour Declaration was, for him, another proof of the separatist and patronizing approach of the Zionist movement. He suggested a different version of Zionism in Palestine that he termed Eastern Zionism, which is embedded in the Eastern culture and not seeking to change it. We can find this critique in one of his articles published in August 1921, if you can change that, and I'm quoting. The root of evil in our work that produced the rupture with the Arabs is that we deserted our Oriental Mizrahi culture whose basis is Arab culture and brought in Western culture in its place. The new culture is completely opposed to the culture and mind of the people of this country. It turns us into a foreign, alien element and that threatens to destroy the foundation of their Arab culture. It is that which makes them angry. The principal condition for being good neighbors, as well for a mutual Jewish-Arab trust before we come to propose to the Arab people what Epstein wants to offer them is one: return to our Oriental culture. In other words, relations with the Arabs should not be pursued from a position of supposed superiority, but from understanding that Palestine is located in the East and its inhabitants belong to the Eastern culture. During the same months that Ben-Kiki composed these articles, Yosef Chaim Kastel worked on a plan for, that he titled, A Solution to the Arab Question in Eretz Israel. In October 7, 1921, Kastel submitted his proposal to the head of the World Zionist Organization, Chaim Weizmann. He also sent a copy to Menachem Osishkin, then the head of the Zionist Commission. His document stood out from the relatively large pool of proposals and documents written on the subject by Zionist activists, partly because his writer was one of the Sephardi natives of the land, and because of the innovative ideas it presented. The 17-page paper contained a social, economic, political analysis of the Arab population of Palestine alongside concrete proposals for repairing relations between Jews and Arabs. Born in Jerusalem in 1899, Kastel joined the Ottoman army during the First World War. After that, he joined the public relations staff of the Zionist Commission, serving as a secretary of its political department and head of the press bureau. His proposal should therefore be seen not as those of an oppositional figure, but as an attempt to contribute to the Zionist movement from his position and experience as a native Sephardi. Kastel's paper began with a detailed analysis of the political opinion among the Palestinian Arabs, including Arab opponents of Zionism. He granted a central role to the Balfour Declaration. If you can change the slide, please. As is known, the Balfour Declaration is the main barrier to collaboration with the Arabs. It frightens them. By referring to a Jewish home in Palestine, the second restriction clause, that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, does nothing to dismiss these fears. Kastel continues, the leaders of the Arab movement will never give up their demands for the Balfour Declaration to be cancelled. And on the other hand, our leaders will never give up this vital historical document, particularly the national home phrase. So in many ways, satisfying both of these demands is impossible. Another slide, please. Then he concludes, with his proposal to the Balfour Declaration the Balfour Declaration should be revised to satisfy both sides, warring over one country, who must, by historical decree, live together and develop in peace and harmony their two national homes in the same country that will one day be a single state. And what should the new version be? Thus, the second negative clause, specifying that the rights of non-Jews should not be harmed, should be rewritten by Balfour himself in a positive manner, such as on condition that they develop the existing national home of the other inhabitants, their education, agriculture, trade, and so on, and protect their legal rights to the land. This was original and bold proposal from a Zionist perspective. Kastel recognized that Palestine was a national home of the Arabs who lived there, and thus proposed that the British, via Balfour himself, decreed that Palestine was also the national home of the Palestinian Arabs. In Kastel's proposal, one can identify the Ottoman ethos of a shared homeland that acknowledged the multiple affiliation and claims to the land. It differs from the Balfour Declaration spirit and the Zionist dominant discourse of his time, which argues for one exclusive Jewish homeland. In that point, we can find similarities between Kastel and Ben-Kiki's argument, which shares the same point of view as Sephardi natives. Kastel's proposal remained unanswered. No one in the Zionist leadership responded to the Kastel proposal, let alone change Zionist attitude towards the Balfour Declaration or the Arabs. Examining this kind of neglected possibilities in the history of Zionism and Israel-Palestine sheds new lights on these key formative events in the history of Zionist-Arab conflict. Shifting the focus to the Sephardi natives enable us to identify cultural and political visions that emerged at the time, but were neglected, marginalized, and forgotten, and to trace episodes of resistance, disruption, and dispute that appeared during these crucial moments and vanished from the official historical narrative. It also an opportunity to rethink contemporary political and cultural reality outside the logic of partition, which has dominant political and academic discourse in Israel-Palestine for over a century.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for their introductory remarks. At this point, we're going to have some conversation, but in parallel, I want to ask Dr. Mora from the Center for Jewish History. We'll start walking around with pieces of paper and pencils, I think, for your questions, okay? So you've heard each other's trajectories, as I'm calling them, and I want to invite you now to juxtapose the ideologies that you have talked about in relation to what you've heard from others to help to crystallize and sharpen what are the definition of Zionism that that the persons or the people that you're talking about, what are they developing? And taking from the previous panel, the idea that Zionism is an attempt to resolve a set of problems, I think that we're already hearing that different ideologies related to Zionism come out of responding to different problems. And so when you reflect on how is Zionism being used or defined, I think it's important to also to identify what is the problem that this notion of Zionism is trying to resolve. And we're going to go back to Zohar.
Zohar, why don't you?
Okay.
We'll go back to Zohar, who's been listening patiently.
Okay, I will be very brief. First, I think that from all three short presentations, we can see that the American Zionist leadership have their own perspective about what is Zionism. And it's completely different from the Palestinian and the European perspective. And they didn't want to be just supporter of the Zionist project. They wanted to be involved. And for them, the Zionist movement, the establishment of a Jewish state, was a diasporic project. And because it couldn't be done without their support, they have the right to be involved and to be part of this project. And maybe it's relevant till today. And I think that the only thing that Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann in complete agreement was that they both wanted to use the advantages of the American Zionist support, but to stop as much as they could the involvement of the American Zionist leadership in the Zionist project.
I'm not quite sure where to start. Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard. I do feel like there's a slight apples and oranges thing here because, I mean, I was talking about one very specific person and his fairly perverse sense of things. It obviously connects to much larger trends. I think, Zohar, you were talking about something that's more about the actual leadership and where they stand, and then you're talking about something completely different, which is very much on the ground. And I mean, one thing that keeps coming up is that there are sort of different languages being spoken, not just Hebrew and English, but all kinds of languages. And I feel like somebody like Hecht, he didn't have a clue what was going on. I mean, I'm not sure he even knew what Sfaradim, Mizrahim were. He certainly knew who Weizmann and Ben-Gurion were, and he considered them sort of enemies. But he had a very shabby sense. I mean, he just didn't know, and he actually never set foot in the place, it's important to say. So that his Zionism is very much a kind of American conversation, and it has to do primarily with the response to the Holocaust and a kind of rage at what they hadn't managed to do. So that it almost seems hard to put these things side by side. I don't know if you want to,
Yeah, so I agree, yeah. So I think that, yeah, definitely what maybe come up is if we go into the history, we see a different kind of imaginations. In panel before this, they spoke about imperial imaginations, definitely very strong in Zionist thinkers and possibilities in the beginning until maybe 1942. The empire was the set of mind. Even for the Ottoman local scholars that I was thinking, they were thinking maybe the Ottoman as a imagination of a political face. I think that what comes up is that, nobody imagined in that moment that Palestinians won't live in the land after 48. I think that's the moment of big change that wasn't around in this kind of imaginations that happened. And for me, it's interesting because I think the connection lines between us, it's what happened to the Sefaradis in the 1920s, 30s in Palestine. So some of them moved to the right, moved to revisionists because of the rejection from the left, socialist, labor leaders. They joined forces with the right, even though some of them continue speaking about Arab and thought that that's going together. But this is interesting to see what happened there. And when we're talking about Mizrahim today and their support, we need to go to this kind of a long history. And the moment of 1917 is a very important. I wanted to bring back the Ottoman context to the land. If you want to understand the natives, Arab, Palestinians, and Sephardi, you have to understand the Ottoman context for this kind of conversation.
Thank you. Given that this symposium is designed to help us understand both the historical arc and also today, I want to invite each of you to think out loud about how these apples and oranges can help us either think differently or strengthen. As Yuval, at the end, you touched a little bit on this question that, why are so many Mizrahi Jews in Israel so right-wing, given what you just laid out? And so if you can now pull from the materials that you've shown, these historical documents, and starting to think about what are the different problems they're resolving and the different ideologies that they're developing, what's useful for thinking about Zionism today? Okay, maybe we'll start with Adina.
Yeah.
And then we'll go the other way.
Well, it's a great, hard question. I mean, I think for me, again, I'm talking about a specific individual and his perspective, but I do think that there are more general themes or notions that we might take from his model. I wouldn't model anything on Ben Hecht. Again, he was very perverse and he was contradictory. But I do, and I should also say that my politics are about as far as it's possible to get from Ben Hecht's. His celebration of the terrorists is, for me, despicable. I mean, they were terrorists. I think it was right of him to call them terrorists, but what they did was deplorable, to my mind. But I would say that for me, there's a kind of interesting model here in terms of a kind of long-term thinking and a willingness to speak truth to power. Because you have to remember that while it's true that the sort of descendants of the revisionists are now in power in Israel, that was very much not the case. It was a fringe movement at the time. It was a very small part of the Jewish population worldwide that supported the positions that Bergson and Hecht held. And I think it's interesting that he was willing to stand up and say some very unpopular things. I mean, I didn't get to tell you what happened in the wake of that terrorist ad. I mean, he basically was blacklisted in Hollywood. He couldn't work because the British wouldn't show his movies, and so the studios wouldn't hire him. And he was accused of incitement to murder, and even his own very close friends, people like Herman Mankiewicz, who wrote Citizen Kane, they were very, very close. And Mankiewicz was furious at Hecht, really felt that it had made him impossible for him to live in his own country. And also, when asked, why is your friend talking this way? How could he support terrorism? He said, well, Ben found out he was a Jew 6 years ago, so now he's acting like a 6-year-old Jew. But my point is larger than that, is that he was willing to stand up for something and risk his livelihood for it. And the fact is that over the decades, that perspective has actually proven to be a very not just popular, it's the dominant perspective. And so that for me, the model here is a structural one. I mean, I think my positions, if I were to speak them out loud here, would be very unpopular. If I were to say that I actually think a binational state is really the only solution to this problem, that we find ourselves in, that Palestinians and Jews need to live together as citizens with equal rights from the river to the sea. You're probably not going to love me for that, but I do take a certain inspiration from Ben Hecht, which may sound odd, and this is where what you were saying, these things meet up, where the right and the left do come in contact. So maybe I'll just leave it there. If you want to throw anything at me, you can throw it.
Okay, so I think that, yeah, I definitely agree with you that we in many ways, we need to rethink outside of this kind of partition. You know, when I said partition, we started with the British, logical partition that, of course, we know that transferred not only in Palestine, also in India, Pakistan, and Ireland, and Cyprus, and other places. And all the solutions are stuck with this kind of partition of lands. And so definitely we need to rethink outside of it. And definitely we see that most of the players on ground, not only the Sephardi, was thinking outside of this kind of partition in certain moments. So this is not something that we have to think through that. One of the things that I will bring out with the Ottoman, and I have many things to say, is that the Ottomans allow us to think with multiple names and affiliations. So the area that we call Middle East, there are people that have multiple affiliation to different kind, their religion, their territory, their language, their identity. It's not only in Palestine, it's also in Lebanon, in Iraq, in other places, and what happened in 1917 erupted it. So I think that we need to be more attuned and more sensitive to people using different kind of names of the land itself, Palestine, Israel, for instance, or Bilad al-Sham, or other names, or affiliation, like Palestinian Israelis, or Arab Jews, or others, that the only way to understand the history of the place is this kind of multiple affiliation. I think the way forward is to be attuned to this kind of multiplicity when we think on any solution or any way going forward.
I will try to bring my perspective as historian and as an Israeli. As a historian, I think that from all the three presentations, we can understand that, of course, we are sitting here in the middle of Manhattan, if I may say so, and talking about American Zionist history, but it's not just an American Zionist history. It's relevant to the world, to the Jewish world. And we cannot understand Israel history and Palestinian history, and maybe European Jewish history without the American perspective. It's very, I think it's very important. And another thing that we can learn from our session, how much the involvement of the American Jewish, of the American Zionist movement and the American Jewish community in general in the Zionist project, in the Jewish community in Palestine before 48, and in Israel after 48 is important. So don't be just supporters. Be involved in what happened in Israel. And I think it's very relevant what happened today in Israel.
Thank you. I thank you for all your questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. And those of you who offered comments, I will pass them along to the panelists. I want to pull out one question that relates to all three of you. And I'll read that question, and then I'd like to read a few other questions and invite each of you to respond to the general question and then the comments, okay? And I was very struck by this question. In what ways have these minority, in quotation, minority views, and in the category of minority views, this person put Hadassah, Mizrahi, Hecht, and Palestinian Arabs' interests, in what ways have these views become reflected in Israel today? Okay? And what's striking about the question is that, one of the dynamics that's come out of this panel is it's very hard to put your finger on what's the majority and what's a whole set of minorities, right? Because there were so many different voices at the time that it's hard to say, okay, this is mainstream and these are minorities. If you're putting Hadassah in a minority perspective, that means that perhaps we've done our work a little too well, and that we've lost a little bit of an anchor of majority-minority. And so I want to throw this question back to you, Also in terms of helping us to navigate, where does the positions that you're representing fit in a kind of spectrum, so that we don't walk away from this panel feeling a little at sea of, what was actually going on. So that's while you're mulling that one, okay? There are a few questions for Adina specifically. Why wouldn't US Jews be happy to be informed about the Shoah by Hecht? Why do they resent it? Question number one. Question number two is, in Hecht's work with the American League for a Free Palestine and the fight for a global Jewish army, it was sort of a non-national or global initiative for a nationalist Jewish one.
Was it a national?
I guess it's stated as a sentence, but it might be a question. Meaning, was his work with the American League for Free Palestine, was it nationalist or non-nationalist? Is this oxymoronic, counterproductive? And what do you regard as his lasting legacy? Okay? I know a lot. You're writing this down? Okay. Yuval, you identify Kastel as having a more respectful approach to the Arabs, and this was reflective of a Sephardi approach. Yet Kastel recognized that the Arabs wouldn't accept a Jewish state. Could this approach have been worked out over the longer term? A second question, did the Sephardi Mizrahi people fear the Arab majority under the leadership of Hajj Amin al-Husseini? Meaning, how did they respond to Muslim radical rejectionism, I would say. Okay.
Maybe Yuval will go first.
Yuval, you go first, and then Adina, and then Zohar will get the last
Okay,
one.
I think the question of minority is very important. I think that we need to be, again, in historical sense, to think when one become minority. Definitely the Sephardi and the Palestinian inhabitants of the land in the end of the Ottoman Empire was the majority, not only by numbers, by control as well, and in the discourse. They became minor in the Jewish Zionist discourse in the 1920s, 30s, and it's a process of becoming minority. So in many ways, to go back to this kind of possibilities is to, to bring back this kind of voices that weren't only minority voices. But definitely today, they are in the margin, this kind of ideas and possibilities are in the margins of both national discourses, because they in many ways defy the nationalistic kind of monolingual and one-dimensional kind of a possibility. But I think that many of the people are going back now. There is, again, maybe in the margins, but I think very fruitful and very interesting margins to rethink about other possibilities for the futures. In Haaretz just had a big article about the thinking outside of the partition and the different kind of division of the land, or maybe one state, and it's in both sides. The Palestinians are thinking of it maybe longer than the Israeli left, but definitely in the Israeli left and some of the Palestinians in Israel. And I think it's fruitful to think, even without thinking if it's possible. I think nothing today is very possibility to be in the next day, but I think it's good to put few of these kind of imaginations in the, and Zionism was always playing like that. It's not that something is very foreign. Zionism was always playing in different kind of imagination and possibilities from day one. The question on Kastel, again, we are playing with what the Arabs will say, but back then nobody thought about a state a sovereign state, not to the Arab and not to the Jews in the 1920s. There was all a formation under a British mandate of a homeland. Definitely back then, it's something that maybe will be accepted much, maybe with not on the faction, but maybe with some, definitely better than only a one exclusive Jewish state. I don't know what will come out of it. Definitely this is kind of place in history that you can go along, but I think that we can't really dismiss this kind of thing, thinking today from our perspective about what happened. I think that it's important to bring this kind of, it's a common, I think that I'm always asking myself, how come not others think in the same kind of solution? They have a majority of people living in the land, and then they get in a Balfour Decree that was written to Rothschild that is sitting in Paris and London, people in the land didn't hear about it, including Jews and Arabs. So nobody asked them, and they're bringing them this kind of promise without asking them. That's, of course, that will be, and of course the mass majority was Arab in the land. So how come you can't? And the last question, I don't know how to answer it. I'm not sure that I understood the question, but definitely, again, the Hajj Amin al-Hussein is one function of I didn't have time to present, but the first instinct of the Palestinian leadership in the 1920s to call the Sephardi Jews to come with us, to be part of us, and to emphasize they are not against the Jews, but they're against the Zionists. But I don't have time to go into it.
Maybe I'll just deal with the two questions that were directed straight at me, if I can remember them. I guess the first one was, why wouldn't the Jews of America be happy to hear about the Shoah? Well, no, I don't think anybody was happy, first of all, to hear about it. And I don't think the issue is that they didn't want to know what was going on. I think it was a matter of the way that Hecht and Bergson were presenting this, which was very unconventional. I mean, those ads that I showed you, if you think about the place of humor, a kind of dark humor, $50 for a human head, I mean, that's just not the way that people like Stephen Weiss, I mean, I'm not sure how much his name is remembered now, but this is a very decorous man who likes to do things a certain way. There was a great deal, and whatever you want to say about Stephen Weiss, and he's a complicated figure and a problematic one in a lot of ways, and he was sort of the leader of American Judaism to a certain extent. He was also afraid. A lot of Jews were afraid in this country. They felt that by calling this kind of attention to what was going on, I mean, in this way that Hecht was doing, they were going to bring pogroms here. That didn't happen, but I think it's important to understand, I mean, Raquel, you mentioned earlier on just how different American Jews felt about their Judaism, so that the fact that Hecht was also writing those articles, my tribe is called Israel, it was very uncomfortable. I mean, people like the Sulzberger family that owned the New York Times, these are Jews who were also themselves very tentative about putting things on the front page about what was going on. And one of the Bergson guys says, basically, they would rather have us on the obituary page. Like, that's a place where Jews belong. So that's, I think, to sort of answer the first question. The second question about the army, I mean, there were all different stages of this campaign. At first, when Bergson recruited Hecht, the idea was to create a Jewish army that would fight with the Allies, and then would also kind of quietly at the same time create these facts on the ground in the Middle East that would lay the groundwork for rebellion against the British. Over time, things shifted, as I explained, and as they became more radical, they also, it's really interesting, and I don't have time to go into all the details, but the terminology splits off. And this is partly about Bergson himself. I think Hecht was completely taking his cues from Bergson, but they start to talk about Jews and Hebrews, and they're two different things. And it's very clear that they're making a point of saying, Jews, like Americans are Jews. You can be here and you belong here. You are not going to be, told to leave for Palestine because of what we're doing. Hebrews are in Palestine. They have guns. There's a very clear sort of, in that play that, a flag is born. Hecht makes this very clear distinction between the sort of the Jews. He actually calls them Tevye and Golda, and they're sort of old and tired, and they're dying on their way, from the graveyards, and they've lost all these children in Treblinka. And then you have David, Marlon Brando, the Hebrew soldier. And he says, we fight, it's pretty striking. It's like I have to stop. Okay. Basically, I guess I'll leave it there. Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, Zohar.
First, I'm not sure that you can say that Hadassah was a minority. We cannot understand the modernity process in Israel without Hadassah. So, and Ben-Gurion said, for example, in 1941, that the most important Zionist organization in the world is Hadassah. So I'm not sure if they're a minority. But most of the Hadassah leadership, not Zoll, but the majority of Hadassah leadership and other American Jewish leaderships, Brandeis, Stephen Wise, Abel Silver, to mention a few, choose to stay in the United States, but try to influence what is happening in Palestine and Israel after 48. It's a huge challenge. Of course, they said that they thought that it's the right. But at the end, what happening in Palestine was determined by by the Zionist leadership in Palestine and in Israel after 48. And it's maybe a question for another symposium, if the alternative of Brandeis and Hadassah leadership was a real alternative for what's happening in Palestine, or maybe Ben-Gurion was right that he said that the perspective regarding what's happening in Palestine, and especially regarding the relationship between Jews and Arab, are just naive.
So I want to leave you with a kind of question, and that is, if the first panel related to, the great thinkers and the Zionist leadership about statism versus Jewish peoplehood, very high-level kinds of questions. This panel, we've moved into the realm of individual thinkers and activists who are struggling with real problems and how Zionism, defined in the different ways we've heard them, can help move forward, influence, or change, or respond to critical questions of their day. And so if we're going to apply what history is teaching us to today, it's not so much about this solution versus that solution, but almost an approach of how do we encounter challenges and questions and problems of today, Jewish problems of today, with the broader collectivist, nationalist, Jewish consciousness that can lead to a direction to a solution. And so then the question to you is, what does that look like, right? And as we continue through the day, hopefully we'll keep developing this forward. Thank you very much. Thank you to our esteemed panelists.